Rain pattered against the patrol car windshield as officers James Miller and Michael Reynolds prowled through Oakwood Hills, their dashboard computer casting an eerie blue glow across their faces while the wealthy neighborhood slumbered beneath the stormy morning sky. Miller drummed his fingers on the steering wheel, his 10 years on the force evident in the way his eyes constantly scanned the perfectly landscaped properties surrounding them. These mansions with their manicured lawns and imported cars never sat right with him, making his monthly mortgage payments on a cramped apartment across town. Reynolds dozed in the passenger seat, his rookie status showing in the way he struggled to stay alert during their early morning patrol shift. The veteran officer glanced at his partner with mild disgust, wondering how the academy standards had fallen so low in recent years. The cruiser rolled past towering oak trees, their branches heavy with raindrops casting strange shadows across the wet pavement. Miller liked this neighborhood best during these quiet dawn hours when the privileged residents were still nestled in their expensive beds behind their state-of-the-art security systems. He enjoyed feeling like a guard dog prowling the perimeter, keeping the riffraff out of this pristine bubble of American success. The thought made him smile as he turned onto Maple Drive, where the houses grew even larger, their colonial facades looming like castles in the gray morning light. Movement caught his attention, making him straighten in his seat, his hand instinctively moving closer to his weapon. A figure emerged from behind one of the largest houses on the street, a black woman in an emerald green designer suit that probably cost more than his monthly salary. She was walking quickly toward a sleek black Mercedes, her heels clicking against the wet pavement, while she juggled what looked like legal documents in her arms. Miller elbowed Reynolds awake, his partner snorting and sitting up quickly to hide the fact he'd been sleeping on duty. "Check this out," he sneered. "Another one trying to case these houses. Bet those papers she's carrying are stolen." Reynolds blinked the sleep from his eyes, taking in the scene as the woman reached the luxury car, his cynicism quickly matching his partner's. Miller killed the cruiser's headlights, letting it roll silently closer to the Mercedes, while the woman fumbled with her keys in the dim morning light. He could see her designer handbag, the expensive watch glinting on her wrist, and the way she carried herself with an air of authority that made his jaw clench. These people coming into their district, acting like they owned the place, showing off their money and success, while hard-working cops like him could barely make ends meet. Reynolds was fully awake now, his hand also moving to rest near his weapon as Miller flipped on the cruiser's lights, the blue and red flash cutting through the rain like lightning, making the woman freeze in place. Both officers exchanged knowing looks as Miller radioed in their location and intention to investigate a suspicious person. This was the part of the job they enjoyed most, keeping the natural order of things, teaching people where they really belonged in this world. Reynolds already had his door open, ready to approach, while Miller took one last look at the spotless houses surrounding them. These residents would thank them later for keeping their neighborhood safe, even if they never said it out loud. The cruiser's lights continued their predatory dance across the wet pavement as both officers emerged into the rain, their boots splashing through puddles as they moved to surround the woman who stood frozen beside her car. Neither officer noticed the small security camera mounted above the garage, its lens capturing every moment of what was about to unfold in perfect digital clarity. Sarah Thompson clutched her case files to her chest, cursing herself for running late to court. The morning had started badly when her alarm failed to wake her at 5 a.m., breaking her 15-year routine of early morning preparation. She had spent the last hour speed reading through the documents for today's high-profile drug trafficking case, her phone buzzing incessantly with messages from the court clerk about the growing media presence outside the courthouse. Normally she would have reviewed everything the night before, but her son's college acceptance celebration dinner had run late, leaving the files untouched on her desk. Her mind raced through the key points of the case as she hurried toward her car, the rain dampening her carefully pressed suit. She had worked too hard over 20 years, building her reputation as the most thorough judge in the circuit, to let one morning of tardiness affect her performance. The pressing weight of the case files against her silk blouse reminded her of the hundreds of pages she still needed to review, Before taking the bench in less than 30 minutes, her phone buzzed again, probably the clerk wondering where she was, or worse, the district attorney demanding a pre-trial conference. The sudden flash of police lights made her stomach drop, cutting through her mental review of case law precedents. She had seen those lights too many times before in her rearview mirror over the years, despite her Mercedes being in perfect condition and her driving being impeccable. She knew the drill all too well. Two officers approached from different angles, their hands hovering near their weapons in a way that made her heart rate spike. Despite her years on the bench, despite her Harvard law degree, despite the fact that she stood in her own driveway, their faces wore expressions she had seen countless times in her courtroom, a mix of disdain and presumed authority that made her blood run cold. Judge Thompson drew herself to her full height, summoning the same commanding presence that had prosecutors trembling during difficult cross-examinations. "My name is Judge Thompson, and this is my home," she stated firmly, watching their expressions shift from smug certainty to momentary confusion before hardening into something worse. The taller officer, Officer Miller, according to his nameplate, stepped closer, his hand still resting on his weapon in a clear intimidation tactic she had seen documented in dozens of civil rights cases that had come before her bench. The rain fell harder now, soaking through her suit, as she reached slowly, deliberately for her judicial ID, the same ID that opened every courthouse door in the circuit, that commanded respect in legal circles across the state. Officer Reynolds moved to block her movement, his stance aggressive, his eyes filled with disbelief and something that looked dangerously like anger. She could feel her cell phone vibrating in her pocket, probably the clerk again wondering why the most punctual judge in the circuit was running late. The irony of the situation struck her, even as anger and fear battled in her chest. 20 years on the bench, handling the most sensitive cases in the state, from death penalty appeals to corruption trials, and here she stood in her own driveway being treated like a criminal. Her security cameras whirred quietly above, capturing everything just as they had captured every moment since she had them installed after the last time she had been pulled over without cause 3 streets from her house. The younger officer, Reynolds, sneered at her attempts to explain, flipping through her wallet with obvious skepticism, as though her bar association card, her judicial ID, and her driver's license were elaborate fakes. Her files were getting wet, the precious papers containing notes on a case that could send 3 cartel members to prison for life. Dampening in the increasing rain, she thought about her son away at college, now living in a world that she had tried to protect him from, even as she knew she couldn't, about the cases waiting for her, about the media probably gathering outside her courtroom, and about how some things never seemed to change no matter how many laws were passed or how many glass ceilings were shattered. The blue lights continued their dizzying dance across her wet driveway as the situation spiraled beyond her control. The cold steel of handcuffs bit into Judge Thompson's wrists as Officer Miller shoved her toward the cruiser's backseat, the metal cutting against her skin with unnecessary force. She could feel her silk suit getting ruined by the rain, while her mind raced through every civil rights statute being violated in this moment. Her briefcase slipped from her shoulder, spilling across her manicured lawn, sending critical case files scattering into deepening puddles. Years of legal experience told her to stay silent, to document everything, to let the evidence speak for itself later. But the sight of her work being destroyed tested her resolve. Reynolds moved with exaggerated slowness toward her Mercedes, taking obvious pleasure in conducting his search. Her judicial robes, visible through the window, did nothing to deter him as he yanked open the car door, letting more rain soak into the leather interior. She watched helplessly as he carelessly tossed aside law books that had been with her since Harvard, her personal notes on ongoing cases fluttering in the wet breeze, while he made snide comments about how criminals were getting creative these days with their disguises. Miller kept one hand on her shoulder, pushing her roughly into the back seat. Despite her complete compliance, the indignity of the moment burned deep in her chest. From her new position behind the mesh divider, Sarah focused on memorizing every detail, forcing herself to be the meticulous judge she was known for in the courtroom. She noted Officer Miller's badge number 4591, The way his nameplate was slightly askew, the timestamp on the cruiser's dashboard reading 8:47, she recorded mentally how Reynolds' badge 6720 gleamed in the morning light as he continued to violate every search protocol she had ever ruled on. In her courtroom, her security cameras, mounted at 3 different angles, captured it all their high-definition lenses, recording every moment, every violation, every abuse of power. The rain drummed steadily on the cruiser roof, creating a soundtrack to this surreal scene, as Miller radioed in that they had detained a suspicious person claiming to be a judge. The word claiming dripped with sarcasm through the radio static. She could see her neighbor's curtains twitching as the spectacle unfolded. Mrs. Anderson from next door, who had attended her swearing-in ceremony 5 years ago, peering out in confusion. While Reynolds continued his illegal search, she thought about her son again, about the conversations they had about dealing with law enforcement, about how his Harvard acceptance letter lay proudly on her desk, about how none of that mattered in moments like these. 45 minutes crawled by like a lifetime as the officers made phone calls, checked and rechecked her identification, called in her vehicle registration and plates, while openly discussing their disbelief that someone like her could live in this neighborhood. Their voices carried clearly through the cruiser's partition as they debated the authenticity of her credentials. Sarah sat perfectly still, her training as a judge helping her maintain composure, even as she felt herself shifting between fury and fear. Her phone had stopped buzzing now, the courthouse, probably assuming she had been delayed by an emergency, never imagining their respected colleague was handcuffed in a police car 3 feet from her own front door. Finally, after what seemed like hours, Miller opened the back door, the rain having slowed to a drizzle. He removed the handcuffs with the same rudeness he had applied them, his face showing no hint of apology or recognition of his mistake. Reynolds stood by the Mercedes, surrounded by the scattered remnants of her case files, his boots muddy from trampling over critical evidence in a federal drug trafficking case. "Well, Judge," he said, the word twisted into an insult, "next time carry better ID with you." She stood slowly with all the dignity she could muster, her suit ruined, her wrists bruised, her case files destroyed, but her mind was already spinning forward, planning, calculating, remembering. She watched them climb into their cruiser and drive away, leaving her standing in her driveway, surrounded by the wreckage of their prejudice, her security cameras still rolling, capturing the final moments of an incident that would soon shake the entire department to its core. 2 weeks crawled by before fate orchestrated its masterpiece. Officers Miller and Reynolds strode through the courthouse corridors, their polished boots clicking against the marble floors with practiced confidence. Miller adjusted his dress uniform one last time. Their testimony in this drug bust case was routine, just another day of them cleaning up the streets. As they approached courtroom 304, the carved wooden doors loomed before them like ancient gates to judgment, their brass handles gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Reynolds checked his watch, noting they were exactly on time, just as they had rehearsed their testimony the day before. The heavy doors swung open with a familiar creak, the sound echoing through the high-ceilinged chamber. As both officers entered, the afternoon sunlight, streaming through tall windows, cast long shadows across the packed gallery filled with attorneys, defendants, and curious law students. Miller nodded to the familiar faces of the court staff, his usual swagger carrying him forward until something made him stop dead in his tracks beside him. Reynolds suddenly grabbed his arm with unprecedented force, their synchronized footsteps falling into chaos as recognition dawned. Time seemed to freeze. The figure on the bench was unmistakable. Judge Sarah Thompson sat in her full judicial regalia, her dark eyes meeting theirs with arctic calm, her hands folded precisely on the polished wooden bench before her, just as they had seen her hands folded on her steering wheel 2 weeks ago, the same hands they had callously handcuffed her presence, commanding the room exactly as she had tried to command their attention in her driveway that rainy morning. The irony of the situation crashed over them like a tidal wave. Reynolds' fingers dove deeper into Miller's arm as the court clerk called their case number, the sound echoing like a death knell in the suddenly silent room. Miller felt sweat beginning to bead along his hairline as he forced himself to move forward, his legs feeling like lead, each step bringing them closer to the bench where their victim now sat as their judge, the same woman whose car they had searched, whose credentials they had mocked, whose dignity they had trampled, was now dressed in the full authority of her office, her black robes seeming to absorb all light, her expression unreadable, as she observed their approach through the same eyes that had watched and destroy her case files in the rain. The gallery behind them buzzed with whispered conversations as regulars in the courthouse picked up on the unusual tension in the room. Public defenders, who had argued before Judge Thompson hundreds of times, leaned forward in their seats, sensing something extraordinary was about to unfold. Reynolds tried to catch his partner's eye, but Miller stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched so tight it looked painful as they took their places at the prosecution table beside the district attorney, who remained oblivious to the dramatic undercurrents swirling through his routine drug case. Judge Thompson lifted her gavel with deliberate grace, the same hand that had held up her judicial ID in her driveway, now commanding complete silence in her domain. The sound of it striking the wooden block reverberated through the courtroom like a thunderclap, calling the session to order. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the same calm authority they had dismissed 2 weeks ago, except now it filled the entire chamber with undeniable power. "Good afternoon, gentlemen," she said, her words cutting through the tension like a steel blade as she shuffled the papers before her, the same types of papers that had been scattered and ruined by their reckless search. The district attorney launched into his opening statement, unaware that his star witnesses were sitting beside him, pale and rigid, their eyes fixed on the bench as the reality of their situation sank in deeper. With each passing second, Judge Thompson appeared to listen attentively, taking notes with the same meticulous care she was known for, while Miller and Reynolds shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, knowing their moment on the witness stand drew closer with each tick of the courtroom clock. Their testimony about proper police procedure and probable cause now taking on a completely different meaning under the steady gaze of someone who had personally experienced their disregard for both. Sweat beaded on Officer Miller's forehead as he took the witness stand, his dress uniform suddenly feeling 2 sizes too small under the courtroom's harsh fluorescent lights. Judge Thompson orchestrated the proceedings like a maestro conducting a symphony, her questions about the drug case starting simple and straightforward, lulling him into a false sense of security before she began her real examination. "Officer Miller, please explain to the court your understanding of probable cause." Her voice carried the weight of 2 decades on the bench, while her eyes held the memory of that rainy morning. Miller tugged at his collar as he fumbled through his rehearsed response. The gallery had grown fuller as word spread through the courthouse that something extraordinary was unfolding in courtroom 304. Legal interns pressed against the back wall, while veteran attorneys found excuses to slip inside, watching Judge Thompson systematically dissect the officer's testimony, her precise questions drawing subtle parallels between the current case and her own experience without ever directly referencing it. "Officer Miller, when you approached the suspect's vehicle, what protocols did you follow?" she asked, knowing every person in the room with law enforcement experience would recognize the procedural violations in his answer. Reynolds sat at the prosecution table, his own anxiety mounting as he watched his partner struggle through cross-examination. Judge Thompson wielded her questions like surgical instruments, each one cutting away another layer of their credibility, her pen scratching notes on her legal pad the same way she had mentally documented their badges and behaviors during her detention. "Did you verify the suspect's identification?" Immediately upon request, she continued, her tone professional, but carrying an undercurrent that made Miller loosen his tie again, his eyes darting to his partner seeking support, but finding only shared dread. The district attorney shifted uncomfortably in his chair as his star witness began contradicting his previous statements about proper search procedures. Judge Thompson allowed Miller to tangle himself in his own testimony, her patience evident as she led him through a detailed examination of police protocols, the same protocols they had violated in her driveway. "Officer Miller, in your experience, what constitutes reasonable suspicion?" she inquired, watching him squirm as he tried to justify actions that suddenly seemed indefensible in the harsh light of her courtroom. Whispers rippled through the gallery as Miller stumbled over questions about racial profiling and community policing. Judge Thompson maintained her composure, her black robes, a symbol of the justice system. They had disrespected, her hands folded calmly on the bench. As Miller grew increasingly flustered, perhaps, Officer Miller, you could explain the department policy on conducting searches of personal vehicles, she pressed, knowing his answer would highlight the irregularities in both cases. The morning sunlight streaming through the tall windows seemed to spotlight him like nature's own interrogation lamp. Reynolds watched helplessly as his partner's testimony crumbled under Judge Thompson's expert examination, each question revealing the gaps in their story, the flaws in their procedures, the biases in their approach. Miller wiped his brow with a trembling hand, his confident demeanor from that morning replaced by barely concealed panic as Judge Thompson referenced specific case law about unlawful detention, her knowledge of every precedent, every statute, every regulation, overwhelming his attempts to justify their actions. The atmosphere in the courtroom grew heavier with each exchange, legal professionals in attendance, recognizing the masterclass in judicial examination they were witnessing. Judge Thompson never raised her voice, never showed a hint of personal vendetta, yet her questioning systematically exposed every flaw in their law enforcement practices. Officer Miller, would you say that your approach to suspicious persons is consistently applied across all demographics? She asked, her words echoing through the silent courtroom as Miller struggled to find an answer that wouldn't further damage their rapidly unraveling credibility, the weight of their own misconduct pressing down on both officers as they realized this testimony would have repercussions far beyond this single drug case. The police chief's face turned thunderous as he reviewed the security footage playing on the flat screen mounted in his office, the crystal clear high-definition video showing every moment of Judge Thompson's detention from three separate angles left nothing to interpretation. Captain Martinez from Internal Affairs stood silently beside his desk, her arms crossed as they watched Reynolds and Miller violate procedure after procedure, their actions documented in damning digital clarity. The chief paused the footage on a frame showing Miller roughly handcuffing the judge, his jaw clenched as he turned to face the growing crowd of senior officers gathering in his office. Judge Thompson's formal complaint lay spread across his desk like a landmine waiting to explode, 17 pages of meticulously documented violations, each one supported by timestamps from the security footage and quoted department procedures, her Harvard law training evident in the precise way she had laid out each infraction, her personal notes from the incident revealing how even while being detained, she had catalogued every mistake, every overreach, every moment of bias. The chief picked up the complaint, again scanning the attached exhibits including photographs of her bruised wrists, her ruined suit, and the scattered case files that had been critical to a federal prosecution. Captain Martinez stepped forward, her tablet displaying a spreadsheet that made the chief's headache worse. 17 similar stops in the past 6 months, all targeting minorities in affluent neighborhoods, a pattern so obvious it seemed impossible that no one had noticed until now. She swiped through page after page of civilian complaints, unofficial warnings, and suspicious activity reports that painted a picture of systematic harassment. Their department's reputation in the community, already fragile, was about to shatter like glass beneath the weight of this revelation. Phones throughout the building had started ringing, journalists hungry for details about the judge who had been profiled in her own driveway. In separate interview rooms, Reynolds and Miller sat sweating through their uniforms as internal affairs investigators methodically broke down their stories, their usual confident explanations about reasonable suspicion and probable cause withering under the harsh fluorescent lights. Reynolds, the younger of the two, had already started to crack, admitting that they had no valid reason to approach Judge Thompson that morning, while Miller stubbornly clung to his story about suspicious behavior, even as the investigators played the security footage showing the judge clearly walking from her own front door to her car. The chief's secretary appeared in the doorway, announcing that the mayor's office was on line 1, while the district attorney's office held on line 2 and 3. Civil rights attorneys had left urgent messages, the implications of the incident spreading through the city like wildfire. Captain Martinez pulled up another screen showing social media exploding with the story, community activists already organizing protests outside the precinct, local news vans beginning to gather in the parking lot like vultures circling a wounded animal. The chief could feel decades of community relations work unraveling with each passing hour. In the break room, other officers huddled around smartphones, watching the security footage that had somehow leaked online, their faces growing increasingly uncomfortable as they recognized their own potential complicity in similar incidents over the years. Conversations about routine stops and reasonable suspicion taking on new meaning as they watched their colleagues destroy their careers in high definition. Veteran officers who had trained Miller and Reynolds stood in shocked silence, their own methods and assumptions suddenly under scrutiny, while rookie officers whispered about policy changes and mandatory retraining. Judge Thompson's professional reputation added weight to every aspect of the investigation, her position making it impossible to dismiss or downplay the incident as previous complaints had been. The chief stared at her complaint, again noting how she had included relevant case law about police misconduct, citing decisions she herself had handed down from the bench, her personal experience now adding devastating credibility to her legal arguments. Captain Martinez cleared her throat, holding up another tablet, showing newly discovered body camera footage from previous stops, the evidence mounting like a tidal wave, threatening to sweep away everyone in its path. Tension crackled through courtroom 304 like electricity before a storm as Judge Thompson prepared to deliver her ruling in the drug case. The afternoon sun slanting through tall windows illuminated dust motes dancing in the air, while the packed gallery held its collective breath. Attorneys, reporters, and law students pressed shoulder to shoulder, watching history unfold before them. Miller and Reynolds sat rigid in their chairs, their earlier testimony having crumbled under her precise questioning, leaving their careers hanging by threads in the heavy silence. Judge Thompson adjusted her reading glasses, her dark robes settling around her shoulders like armor as she lifted the first page of her ruling. Her voice carried the weight of centuries of justice and injustice as she addressed the gallery, speaking about the sacred trust between law enforcement and citizens, her words echoing off the wooden panels that lined the courtroom walls. Before I address the specific matters of this case, she began, her tone measured and clear, I feel compelled to speak about the broader implications of what we have witnessed in this courtroom today. The district attorney shifted uncomfortably in his chair as Judge Thompson methodically dismantled the prosecution's case, her analysis exposing not just procedural errors but deeper systemic issues in how evidence had been gathered and suspects had been approached. Her own recent experience, invisible yet present in every carefully chosen word, she cited case after case, building a foundation of legal precedent that left no room for argument. Her reputation for thorough analysis taking on new meaning as she connected each point to fundamental constitutional rights. Officers Miller and Reynolds seemed to shrink in their seats as Judge Thompson addressed police credibility, her words cutting through years of automatic acceptance of officer testimony. The public trust placed in law enforcement, she stated, requires a standard of conduct beyond reproach. Her eyes swept the courtroom, settling briefly on the officers who had violated that trust in her own driveway. The gallery leaned forward as one when she quoted Martin Luther King, "Darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that," her voice carrying layers of meaning that resonated through the chamber. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notepads as Judge Thompson outlined the specific failings in police procedure that had tainted the current case, her ruling becoming a masterclass in constitutional law, each point supported by decades of precedent, her personal experience transforming academic legal theory into lived reality. The afternoon light caught the silver in her hair as she straightened papers before her, the same hands they had handcuffed now wielding the full power of judicial authority. Throughout her ruling, she maintained absolute professionalism, never once alluding to her own detention, yet every person in the courtroom who had heard about the incident could feel the weight of that morning threading through her words. when she spoke about reasonable suspicion, probable cause, and the importance of unbiased law enforcement. The young law students in the back row typed frantically on their laptops, knowing they were witnessing a moment that would be discussed in criminal procedure classes for years to come. As she approached her conclusion, Judge Thompson removed her reading glasses, folding them carefully before her, fixing the entire courtroom with an unwavering gaze. The role of the judiciary, she declared, is not merely to interpret the law, but to ensure its fair and equal application. Her voice took on additional gravity as she continued, when we fail to scrutinize law enforcement actions, when we automatically presume good faith without evidence, when we allow bias to influence decisions, we betray the very principles our justice system was built to protect. The sound of her gavel striking wood punctuated her final words, dismissing the case with prejudice due to constitutional violations. In the collection of evidence, Miller and Reynolds stared at the floor as the gallery erupted in whispered conversations, legal observers already analyzing the broader implications of her ruling for future cases involving police testimony. Captain Martinez from Internal Affairs stood quietly in the back of the courtroom, her presence a reminder that the consequences of this day would extend far beyond this single case. The police department erupted into chaos during the following weeks as Internal Affairs dug deeper into Reynolds and Miller's history, their investigations spreading like wildfire through every precinct, uncovering patterns that could no longer be ignored. Captain Martinez worked through endless nights, her office walls covered with timeline charts connecting incidents, photographs of similar stops, and transcripts of civilian complaints that had previously been buried in administrative limbo. The office's body camera footage revealed a history of harassment so blatant it made veteran investigators clench their jaws in disgust. Reynolds cracked first during his third interview session, the weight of evidence finally breaking through his thin blue line. Loyalty. He sat slumped in the metal chair of interview room B, describing how he'd been trained to view certain people as automatically suspicious in affluent neighborhoods, how senior officers had taught him and Miller to conduct stops that wouldn't leave paper trails, how they justified their actions through a warped lens of protecting property values. His confession, spanning 6 hours of recorded testimony, painted a picture of systemic bias that reached far beyond two officers' poor judgment. Across the hallway, Miller maintained his defensive stance even as investigators played video after video of suspicious stops, his face growing paler with each damning piece of evidence. Captain Martinez laid on the steel table between them, his usual arrogance crumbling as she methodically outlined every violation, every abuse of power, every moment. His prejudices had overshadowed his duty. His service record, once considered exemplary, now revealed a disturbing pattern of targeting minorities in wealthy areas. His excuses about public safety and reasonable suspicion hollow in the face of statistical analysis. The police chief's office became command central for damage control as community protests grew outside the precinct, walls, their chants echoing through the building like a guilty conscience, made audible. Local news crews maintained a constant presence, their cameras capturing every arrival and departure of internal affairs investigators, civil rights attorneys, and union representatives. The mayor's office demanded daily updates, while the district attorney's office began reviewing every case. Miller and Reynolds had ever testified in their credibility, now permanently compromised. Inside the station house, other officers moved through their shifts under a cloud of uncertainty, examining their own behaviors and assumptions in light of the investigation. Rookies whispered about changing times, while veterans defended old methods, their arguments growing weaker as more evidence emerged. The thin blue line began showing cracks as officers faced the reality that silence and loyalty had enabled a culture of bias. The department psychiatrist worked overtime counseling officers, struggling to reconcile their role in a system that needed fundamental change. The disciplinary hearing room, normally a place of administrative routine, transformed into an arena where decades of systematic bias rose to the surface like bodies floating up from a dark lake. High-ranking officers shifted uncomfortably in their chairs as testimony revealed their complicity in ignoring complaints and dismissing civilian concerns. The police union representatives sat stone-faced as evidence mounted beyond any possibility of defense or justification, their usual tactics of delay and denial useless against the weight of video evidence and Judge Thompson's impeccable documentation. Captain Martinez presented her findings to a packed conference room, her voice steady as she outlined 19 separate incidents of discriminatory policing, supported by security footage, body camera video, civilian complaints, and official records. The financial cost to the department in potential lawsuits alone made the budget director wince, while the human cost reflected in testimonies from affected citizens painted a picture of community trust shattered by years of unchecked bias. Miller and Reynolds sat at opposite ends of the table, their once strong partnership dissolved under the pressure of investigation, their careers imploding in slow motion before their colleagues' eyes. The Internal Affairs Report final draft ran to over 300 pages, documenting not just individual incidents but systemic failures in training, oversight, and accountability. Judge Thompson's detention served as a catalyst exposing deeper issues that could no longer be ignored or explained away. Captain Martinez concluded her presentation with recommendations for departmental overhaul as protests continued outside, their voices carried through closed windows demanding change that could no longer be delayed. The thin blue line had finally met an immovable force in the form of irrefutable evidence and a judge who refused to remain silent. Judge Sarah Thompson stood at the podium 3 months later addressing a graduating class of police cadets in the Police Academy auditorium. Sunlight streaming through high windows illuminated her judicial robes as she surveyed the fresh faces before her, each one representing the possibility of change. Her wrongful detention had sparked a reformation in the department, leading to her current role as chair of the newly formed Commission on Equal Justice and Law Enforcement Oversight. The cadets sat at attention, their backs straight, their expressions earnest as they prepared to enter a department transformed by the aftermath of that rainy morning. Behind her on the stage sat the new police chief, selected after his predecessor resigned amid the fallout from the internal investigation. Captain Martinez, now promoted to commander of professional standards and training, and representatives from various community organizations who had fought for decades for the changes now being implemented. Judge Thompson adjusted her microphone, her voice carrying clearly through the packed auditorium as she shared her story not as a victim but as a catalyst for transformation. The security footage from her detention now served as a training video showing future officers exactly how implicit bias could corrupt their judgment and violate their oath. Miller and Reynolds had lost their badges, their careers ending not with the bang of gunfire, but with the quiet shuffle of paperwork. Their termination hearings had been brief, the evidence too overwhelming for even the police union to mount an effective defense, but their legacy lived on in the mandatory bias recognition training now required for all officers, the psychological screening protocols strengthened to identify potential prejudices, and the civilian oversight board that reviewed body camera footage monthly. Judge Thompson watched the cadets taking notes as she outlined the new accountability measures, her own experience giving weight to every word. In her own courtroom, changes rippled outward like waves in a pond. Her fellow judges had begun examining police testimony with renewed scrutiny, questioning probable cause with deeper insight, their own assumptions about officer credibility forever altered by her experience. Defense attorneys cited her case in motions challenging discriminatory stops, while prosecutors underwent additional training on recognizing and addressing bias in law enforcement. The security cameras still recorded faithfully at her home, their presence now a symbol of accountability rather than just protection. The graduating class before her represented the first wave of officers trained under the new protocols, their curriculum heavily. In the audience sat Mrs. Anderson, her neighbor, who had witnessed her detention that morning, now serving on the Civilian Oversight Board alongside other community members determined to prevent similar incidents. Several of Judge Thompson's judicial colleagues attended the graduation, as well, their presence reinforcing the new partnership between law enforcement and the justice system. Her son, home from Harvard for the summer, sat in the front row, his proud smile reflecting how their family had transformed a moment of trauma into a movement for change. Judge Thompson concluded her address by stepping away from the podium, walking closer to the edge of the stage to speak directly to the cadets about power, responsibility, and the sacred trust they were about to undertake tomorrow. She told them, "You will pin on your badges and carry the authority of the law. But remember that true justice requires more than just enforcing rules. It demands wisdom, compassion, and the courage to recognize our own biases." The morning light caught her judicial rings as she gestured, emphasizing her points, the same hands, once bound by handcuffs, now helping to reshape the future of law enforcement. As the ceremony concluded and the cadets rose to take their oath, Judge Thompson watched them file past, each one stopping to shake her hand, their eyes meeting briefly. In moments of silent understanding, the department would never be perfect, she knew, but progress marched forward, one badge, one decision, one changed mind at a time. Outside the academy windows, community members gathered not in protest, but in support, their presence a reminder that healing was possible when justice and accountability worked together. Her security cameras still recorded daily at home, their lenses now capturing a new chapter in law enforcement history, as each graduating class carried forward the lessons learned from that rainy morning in her driveway.